in the prior years, manufacturing was fundamentally high cost in North America and high cost in Europe, and low cost in South America and low cost in Asia. And it was very simple for people to site their plants. If they needed to be in a high cost country because they needed the technology, they went there. If they needed to be in a low cost country, they went to some of the Asian markets or South America. However, it's been mixed up in the last 10 years. So over the last years, from 2004 to 2014, we've seen massive changes in the competitiveness of countries, Australia being one of them, Brazil being another. Brazil was a low-cost country in everybody's minds and probably still is a low-cost country. But Brazil is actually the second highest cost to Australia.
So what have been the factors that have driven that change?
Well, it's productivity and it's wages and it's currency changes. And for some countries, Australia's got a little bit of energy cost increase that makes it, and it's all on a relative basis, of course.
So there has been a lot of discussion about the ways that Australia can tackle a waning manufacturing sector by focusing on innovation or high-tech manufacturing, for example. Right. But is it possible to actually fix things without addressing the underlying reasons that Australia has become such a high-cost country to build things?
Well, you want to do both, right? You want to address the cost because you want to get closer to where it is. But then there's a bunch of things that you can do beyond that, right? Australia's school system is very strong. A lot of my friends' children from Chicago have come down to Melbourne to go to school, and they've loved it. And they've gotten a great education out of it. So there's a lot of things that can be done on that aspects of it. And then, of course, focusing on lean manufacturing and advanced manufacturing. You know, Australia has a very, very strong knowledge workforce, really second to very few other countries. And if we can capitalize on that, that would make Australia a lot more attractive.
Do you think a wage fall is necessary to make Australia more competitive?
No, I don't think a wage fall is how things tend to work when this happens. It has to be a productivity change, and there's lots of things that can be done with automation and other factors to create better productivity. But there has to be confidence in the Australian business community that that can be done, and that's one of the things that might be lacking here. But if a few companies start looking at it, they'll find that the costs of automation have dropped dramatically. We're seeing a lot more automation in the US, which has lower wages and higher productivity already to be able to do this. And I think that can be replicated in Australia.
I suppose the automation thing is a very interesting one right now, and there is a certain amount of anxiety in a number of sectors about automation translating to job losses. Right. Do you think it's possible for that to be avoided?
Well, what happens is you get more manufacturing going on. So it may be that if you had 100 units of manufacturing, you have to get 120 units to be able to not have the job losses. But if you do that right, you can often make that work. And we've seen the countries like the US who have actually made that work quite well.
So exactly what have you seen in the US and the changes maybe since the GFC?
Well, there was a bit of change in the labor management relationships. We see some of the unions cooperating a bit more, which is in the U.S. I think they're coming to different versions of reality in a very good way. We're also seeing more automation being put in place because that reduces the costs. And we're just watching the productivity go up. The workers are much more happy about having a job, and they want to stay in that job. So what we've seen is a big shift. One of the things in the U.S. is that we have a very easy hiring and firing policy. There is some regulation, but there's not as much as there is in most of the world. And that means the U.S. often goes into recession first because it's much easier to fire. On the other hand, it takes the Band-Aid off very quickly, in a sense, and it gets that over with. And then it starts to rebuild itself. And that's what's happening now. We're watching much higher growth in the U.S. economy than we've seen in a while since the global financial crisis. And it's taking place because of that. One of the problems that Europe has is that it doesn't have that ability to hire and fire, in fact, probably even more restrictive than here. And then, therefore, you can't make it work as well. And what happens is Europe comes out of the recession later. This has been a pretty dramatic recession. We're still seeing, quantitative easing now. Still out of Europe, we're seeing interest rates at basically the zero line from Europe. And so Europe has a long way to go. What we've seen in the past few weeks, of course, is a decline in the value of the euro relative to the US dollar, at least, by about 6 or 7 cents. And that may give some help, but there's a lot more to be done.
That sort of industrial relations reform is a heavy topic of debate in Australia right now. So are you suggesting that if rules were loosened to an extent, it might help Australia increase productivity?
I'm not sure you can compare the US to Australia because the US doesn't do it really by rule. It's about by agreement because the laws are very unrestrictive in terms of what happens. So that's agreements between the unions and the management. The government gets involved only in certain things. So an airplane strike or a railroad strike, they will involve themselves. But otherwise, they pretty much keep themselves out of the worker-management relationship. So I'm not sure that would apply here as much as it might in other places.
Now, you were talking before about business confidence. Do you think in a situation like this where there is widespread negativity about the manufacturing sector in Australia, it becomes a self-serving prophecy?
That can happen, and I think Australians need to watch out for that because that could create trouble when trouble may not be necessary. People generally need to have a little bit more optimistic perspective on things, and I hope that that works out well here because this is a wonderful place with a lot of great things that happen, not just from the schools, but the football teams here and all the other things that I certainly enjoy when I come down here. And so this is a great place. And starting to become pessimistic can be a big problem.
Right, and you've mentioned education a number of times. In what ways is that important to boosting the productivity of manufacturing, for example?
Well, some of it is using the educational systems to make sure that they commercialize what they come up with. So a lot of biotech and other kinds of industries can be created, which will create some very good jobs for Australians. And then at the same time, using the schools as also a lever to create jobs.
Fantastic. Hal, thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.